My name's Natalie, and I want to explain why I'm going to be marching on Holyrood on the 5th of September. Right from the start of this pandemic, in the early days in January and February, I really felt as if it was being propagandised. It was just on every newspaper headline, and it just it seemed to be almost exaggerated. Yes, there was a disease that could be deadly, but there are always diseases that could be deadly. Flu kills many people every year, so I'm not denying it. But I really was worried about the direction it was going right from the start, and I did suspect that it was going to lead to a vaccine. Maybe because I'd been reading a lot about vaccinations and the arguments between pro-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, and I don't know. But it just made me question things right from the start. I was the only one of my friends that was questioning things. I am really passionate about mountaineering, hill walking, climbing, and I just felt that there was going to be a situation where you wouldn't be allowed into a climbing centre unless you had all your vaccines up to date. It just gave me this huge feeling of disconnect from my friends. I almost felt that I was going to be literally fighting for my life, which may seem dramatic to some people, but if you are having to stand up and object to having something put in your bloodstream that you don't want, that does equate to potentially fighting for your life. I felt so alone, I just thought, I knew there were people in the States that were feeling the same way that I did, and I knew that there were people in London feeling that way, but no one I knew in Scotland was feeling like that. As lockdown was starting, I was reading all about this, and I heard about Dr. David L. Katz, who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times suggesting an alternative to lockdowns. He was suggesting that the people who were most vulnerable, that they should be protected by the people who were stronger, and that the people who were fit and healthy should be allowed to go about their business, and then they would build up herd immunity with less risk, and then they would be in a better position to help the people that were more vulnerable. And it seemed like a really sensible idea, but when I actually broached it to other people, they just seemed to think that I was being selfish, and this kind of thing. It just felt as if people were taking quite extreme viewpoints, and I thought this was because of all the fear mongering in the press. But it just made me feel so separate from my friends and even my family at times. Anyway, I've got a couple of friends who, although they don't see everything the same way as me, they are happy for me to take a different view from them without getting completely over the top about it. I just felt I had to say what I had to say, especially when the coronavirus bill came out, because it was just, to me, it was horrific the way that our civil liberties were just being trampled on by the government, by these outrageous laws that the opposition, so-called, wasn't opposing at all. So I started a podcast called Imagining Freedom. The only thinking behind it was that I had things to say, and I just felt I had to put it on record. Why do I feel like this? Why are my feelings on this so different from other people's? I think a lot of reasons, but partly because in the late 90s I developed an intolerance to dairy, to cow's milk it turned out. It happened after I'd come back from travelling around the world. I got giardia, which is a kind of stomach bug, and I got antibiotics for it, but they didn't seem to work, and I kept getting more and more antibiotics, which I demanded from my doctor, so I'm not trying to blame her. And eventually it just never went away. I was diagnosed with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and told that I would have to take drugs for the rest of my life every single day. And I just thought, no way. So I started researching, and I found out that if I didn't have any cow's milk products, that the IBS would go away. So for years, I just didn't have any cow's milk. I was able to have goat's milk and goat's cheese. And then a few years ago, I spotted a book in a bookstore called Gut. And I was drawn to it because I was so fascinated and I wanted to know more about what was going on in my gut, by a German doctor called Julia Enders. And it was all about the microbiome and how to build up your immune system through the friendly bacteria in your gut. And I found it fascinating. So after that, I read other books. I read Professor Tim Spector's book, The Diet Myth, which is all about the microbiome. And then I read the book by Professor Martin Blazer. And he believes that antibiotics can actually destroy some of the gut bacteria and lead to things like this. His daughter had a similar experience to mine, but hers was worse. She had giardia after travelling through South America. And she had a lot of antibiotics and ended up getting Crohn's disease. Mine wasn't that bad, luckily, but it just made me think that maybe it was all the antibiotics I took. And it didn't stop me taking antibiotics. I took some just recently because I had really bad toothache and the dentist couldn't treat it because of the lockdown. But I realised that I had to be careful about the amount of antibiotics I was taking. And when I take antibiotics now, I always take a lot of probiotics to build up the gut biota as well. Things like live goat's yogurt, pickles, kombucha, all sorts of things, fruit and vegetables. I eat lots of fruit and veg. So I tend to be quite proactive about my health. It's given me a different perspective on my health. I don't think a pill is going to solve any problems. It's more about having a healthy gut, having a healthy immune system. I also take high doses of vitamin D every day because I know that as a dark-skinned person, vitamin D is made by the action of the sun on the skin. And the darker your skin is, the more protection you have from the sunshine. So you need to take higher doses of vitamin D. And I think that's a key factor. That can be a key factor in COVID-19 and the severity of COVID-19. I think I have the right to choose how I look after my health. I think we're going down a dangerous path of collectivism where we're all expected to act in a sort of herd management way, where if you step outside the herd in any way, you're seen as a kind of outlaw, a scourge on society. And I think this is taking us potentially down a very, very sinister path. In the old days, it would have been the priests who stipulated what we had to do, what the herd or the mob had to do. Now, it's not the scientists, it's scientism that seems to be ordering our lives. And that seems to be run by diktats from the World Health Organization. And I mean it when I say diktats, because the World Health Organization is a public, privately financed body. And a lot of its finance comes from pharmaceutical companies and companies like Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. They have conflicts of interest. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the second largest funder of the World Health Organization, according to its actual website. And the biggest funder is the US, but apparently the US is withdrawing its funding. So I think this is a form of treason that our governments are acting in accordance with this body, which is made up of private interests. The fact that there's been so much censorship over this issue is another big red flag. When the censorship started, there was an idea that they were going to be censoring things which could lead people down the wrong track, could get people into trouble for paying a lot of money for quack doctors or fake cures or something. But this isn't what's happening. Very, very well qualified doctors with long track records are being censored, are even having their careers blighted because of this, because they are not following the establishment science. People like Professor Dolores Cahill, who's an expert immunologist, Professor Knut Witkowski, he had an interview banned on YouTube, not because he was advocating people pay him money or take a particular cure. He was just having an opinion about a subject which he has decades of experience in. Dr. Mohammed Iqbal Adil was struck off for a year, or the General Medical Council have prevented him from working for a year because he voiced opinions which went against the establishment line. The Bakersfield doctors in San Francisco, who simply presented their research in the press conference, which happened to go viral on YouTube. It was banned. And the list just goes on and on and on. So it's not as if people like me are just following a bunch of nonsense. These are highly qualified medical practitioners or scientists who are being denigrated simply because they are not following the establishment line. I think this is a very scary time that we're going into. I have other reasons for thinking this way. When my mother was pregnant with me, I was born in 1962, and she had morning sickness, so she was prescribed thalidomide. She took it for a week, and then she heeded the advice of my grandmother, who used to say, never take any new drugs during pregnancy. So after a week, she stopped taking it, and she said she actually had to hide it from the health visitor, which speaks volumes. So thankfully, I wasn't affected. I think I had funny feet or something. I had to get my shoes built up. But it's made me think over the years. My grandmother was completely uneducated. She was born in Yorkshire, and she worked in a mill from the age of 13. So if any doctors had known what my mum was doing at the time, they'd probably have told her off for listening to old wives' tales. But my grandmother was the one that was right in the end. So science isn't always 100% correct. And sometimes people's instincts or sometimes people's gut feeling is more important. So right from the start of this, I knew that I wasn't going to take the vaccine, and it's not because I'm an anti-vaxxer. In fact, in 2015, I went to Costa Rica, and before I went to the doctor and the nurse, and I just said, what vaccines do I need for going to Costa Rica? And then I just rolled up my sleeves. I didn't think twice about having the vaccines. But I think the idea that this is being mandated in this way, or maybe not mandated, but we're being coerced down this path, I think is very worrying. And I almost feel as if I'm fighting for my life. The idea that someone, against my will, can put something into my bloodstream that I don't want. This is very, very worrying. The other thing that makes me see things maybe differently than many of my friends, I think, is because I've travelled widely. And in 1979, I went to East Berlin. I was only 16 at the time, and it was part of a kind of school trip. I went to Germany to visit friends of the family, and she was a teacher, and she just happened to be running this trip to East Berlin, so I joined, and we were all really excited about it. But it turned out to be a lot more depressing than we'd expected. I remember we were held up for hours at the border, Checkpoint Charlie, and it was because apparently someone had been shot the day before for trying to escape from East Germany. When we got there, I remember there was a big department store, but it had hardly any products. And when you wanted to buy something, and of course everything was overpriced as well, you just had to queue. You had to queue first of all just to get a ticket, and then you had to queue again with that ticket to pay. It just seemed like we were queuing all day. I remember queuing for an ice cream, and then when I got it, it was a real disappointment because it tasted horrible. It tasted of carnation milk, sort of watery carnation milk. And then 10 years later, in 1989, I went to Eastern Europe. I went to Bulgaria, Hungary and Yugoslavia as it was then. And it wasn't quite as bad as East Berlin, but there were queues, there were guards everywhere. There was a guard on every bus. And it just made people a bit careful about what they said. People there was just this atmosphere of oppression. I remember when I went to a cafe, they'd have this long list on the menu, but there would only be one thing in stock. It was crazy. It was a bit like that Monty Python skit about spam. So when lockdown started, the very idea that it was called lockdown, which is a prison term, felt unnatural to me. And then the first thing that happened was that if you went to a supermarket, there were all these queues, and there were security guards wearing yellow vests directing where you had to go. I just could not do that. That was an absolute no-no for me, because it immediately brought back memories of being in Eastern Europe under the Soviets and that atmosphere of oppression. I just thought, no, I ended up shopping at health food shops. I just would not go anywhere that I had to queue in that way. I didn't mind queuing a little bit outside a health food shop if it was more relaxed, but not with all those guards. It's nothing against them, but it just brought back that memory immediately. I just thought, nope. The other place that I travelled to that made me, well, I travelled to communist China. That was a strange place. But I also travelled to Iran in 1995. We were only allowed visas for a week, and the women had to wear head coverings. Most of my friends were absolutely shocked that I was having to wear a head covering to travel through this country. It was seen as a symbol of oppression, of tyranny. I mean, this was an autocratic government. Iran was an amazing place. The people were fantastic, but it was a very repressive government. There was one time where I got out of our Land Rover to take a picture of this. It was in Tehran, there was a big statue, and I just got out and sort of ran across the street, and immediately these bearded guards appeared. And I thought, what have I done? What have I done? And it was because I had run. You're not allowed to run if you're a woman in Iran. But when they realised that I was foreign and I couldn't speak the language and I was on holiday, they became very friendly, thank goodness. But it gave me a glimpse of what life could be like. And now we're having these laws coming into our country. Not just with face masks being mandated by government, but apparently you're not allowed to run for a bus in Wales. I've no idea why. These crazy laws that you usually associate with tyrannical regimes. That's why I refuse to wear a face mask. It's not really about whether it protects people. I don't believe it protects people, but I don't really think that's relevant. And people might think I'm selfish saying that, but I don't think I'm selfish. I don't believe in collectivism. And I think once you get to the stage that the government is mandating what you put in your body, what you put on your person, on your face, then the protection aspect of it doesn't come into it. I have worn a face mask before it was mandated because I was politely asked to by a person who was nervous. That's a different issue. Then I'm happy to do it. But I think when the government says you must wear a face mask in this situation, apart from the fact that it just seems ludicrous, it doesn't make any sense to me. But I think that's a step too far. And I feel that I have to stand up against this. I don't object to anyone else wearing a face mask because the whole point is the choice. If you want to wear one, that's great. And I'm not going to look down on you. I'm not going to mock you. I'm not going to get angry with you. Whatever you wear on your face is your choice. And if you want me to put on a face mask, then ask me politely. That's a different issue. But for the government to say that, this has gone too far. And that is why I'm going to be marching on the 5th of September.